Welcome. Come in. Close the door behind you. Make yourself comfortable and listen closely. In a corner of the world where few ever look, something happens that is worth remembering. There is a fleeting moment, almost imperceptible, just before night falls completely, when the moon reveals herself, but not entirely. She peeks out with a gentleness that resembles hesitation, as if she needs a little more time to decide whether or not to show her full face. And even when she appears to be present, she guards her most faithful secret, her hidden side, that part she never shows, never gives away, never explains. And maybe no one ever told you this clearly, but you have a side like that too. A quiet realm that doesn't show up in your photos or in your speeches. That part of you that doesn't know how to dress to be liked, that has no words to justify itself, that doesn't want to shine, just rest. It isn't broken, it isn't wrong, it's just tired of pretending everything is fine. This audiobook is born from that place, from that delicate shadow where no heroic story begins, but where a quiet truth waits. It doesn't come with solutions, or advice, or promises. It comes the way the moon does, in silence, without asking for permission, without revealing everything. It arrives like a pause, like a crack that doesn't come to break you, but to open you. Because we're not here to turn on spotlights. We're here to rekindle memory, to sit with you right in that place you've never shared publicly. You won't find motivational quotes or tips for faking balance here. No, we didn't come to hand you formulas. We came to speak to you from that place where perfection is a burden and honesty can finally breathe. From the side you never post about, but that secretly screams to be heard. Because even if you deny it, you know there's a part of you that no longer wants to be better. It wants to be free. And freedom begins where the persona ends. Right there, where you can no longer hold the smile, where silence weighs more than words, where your body screams what your mouth has been silencing. This audiobook is for that moment, for that exact second when everything you once knew stops working, and yet you're still here. Let's begin. Chapter 1: The Art of Laughing. When the moon isn't watching. There are days when the moon seems to be watching you, but deep down you know it's not true. She isn't watching, she's just reflecting. And yet, something stirs in your chest. Something you can't tell if it's nostalgia, revelation, or weariness. Because what the moon doesn't show is what belongs to you the most. Her hidden face, your shadow, your unshareable side. They taught you to have goals, to find your purpose, to be strong. But no one prepared you for the moment when your soul can no longer carry the character you worked so hard to build. And that's when the crack begins. Not out of sadness, but out of honesty. In a corner of the world where people smile with their teeth but not with their soul, where screens have replaced mirrors and emotions are managed like limited resources, someone, on an ordinary night, stopped. Not because they couldn't go on, but because there was no point in pretending they could. And right there, in the crack of routine, something began. Not an awakening, something closer to a truth than to a revelation. No background music, no scented candles, no mystical sign, just a sincere pause, a sigh that no longer wanted to disguise itself as mindful breathing. The problem isn't sadness, it's the mask, the constant attempt to appear fine, to appear calm, to appear evolved. The soul suffocates more from what remains unsaid than from what is cried. It's not what happens that hurts, it's what's suppressed. You can meditate, do yoga, repeat affirmations, burn incense, and still feel like something inside you is rusting. Because spirituality without honesty is just anesthesia. The moon has no light of her own, yet she moves the tides, inspires poets, and keeps lovers awake. Her beauty doesn't lie in what she emits, but in what she reflects. We're the same. We reflect what we don't understand. We reflect what lives within us, even if we don't know how to name it. And there, in that imperfect reflection, exists a beauty that can't be manufactured, the beauty of being what we are without having to explain it. Some songs weren't made to entertain, but to remind you of what you've been avoiding. The Dark Side of the Moon isn't a melody, it's a fracture, an echo that slides down the spine of anyone who's ever pretended to have everything under control. Within that sound hide the uncried tears, the silent screams, the thoughts muted just to keep the peace. It's the anthem of those who learn to breathe inwardly because the world never let them breathe out loud. Clara didn't know why that song affected her so deeply. Maybe because it always played when she tried to run from herself. She was on her way to an interview after weeks locked away inside thoughts that didn't include anyone else. The world applauded her for trying, for staying upright, for not giving up. But she knew it was all a lie. She didn't want another job opportunity. She wanted to cry without it being labeled a failure. The song played in the background of a store while she waited in line. She felt a small pinch in her chest. Not pain, a memory, a crack, a truth she hadn't wanted to see. She walked to the restroom not to hide, but finally to meet herself. She closed the door, leaned against the wall, and let the tears do what no self-help plan ever could. There was no epiphany, no transformation, just a woman sitting on the floor, breathing for the first time without pretending. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes that's everything. After that moment, she didn't write a book, didn't start a blog, didn't give motivational talks. She just started living a little slower, breathing more honestly, looking at herself without filters, treating the parts of herself she once treated with judgment, with tenderness. And she realized it wasn't about progress. It was about inclusion. She didn't need a new version of herself. She just needed to inhabit the old one with more love. The moon doesn't apologize for waning. She doesn't explain why she disappears for days. She doesn't justify herself. She also doesn't realize how important she is to poets, to lovers, to dreamers. She's just there, orbiting. And suddenly, she's full, lighting up everything with her silver glow, asking for nothing, following no rule, just being. So think, analyze, and you'll see that her light isn't for shining, but for reflecting. She simply does what she's meant to do. She withdraws, and when she's ready, she returns. And that's how we should be too. We don't have to shine all the time. We don't have to explain every shadow. We don't have to justify every absence. You don't have to understand everything to breathe. You don't have to be okay to deserve rest. You don't have to have answers to start looking within. The only thing you need is to stop pretending, because no one becomes enlightened by denying what they feel. No one gets free by silencing their chaos, and no one becomes more authentic by trying to look authentic. Most people aren't broken. They're tight, confined in a version of themselves that no longer resonates, but they keep it up because everyone else likes it. It's like living in a house that no longer fits you, but you don't move out because you decorated it with phrases that sound nice. And then, one night you sit alone, not because you want to meditate, but because you can't do anything else. Your throat aches from holding back. Your eyes sting from not crying. And in that uncomfortable stillness, you see it. Your other face. Not the pretty one, the real one. The one that hates for no reason, that judges in silence, that envies and feels ashamed of it, that laughs at pain, that desires what it shouldn't, that in some hidden corner wants to disappear. But also the one that loves beyond measure, that laughs when no one's watching, that writes messages never sent, that dreams of dancing in the kitchen with no one filming, that still believes everything makes sense even if it can't explain. Why? That's you too. No one told you. No one applauded it. No one gave you permission to integrate it. Because we live in a world that only rewards visible light. But you're done pretending to be illuminated. You want to be human. There is nothing more revolutionary than a soul that keeps laughing, even when the world has no idea why. Maybe it's because laughter, that raw, unapologetic burst of joy, is the first proof that we're still alive. That no matter what happens, the heart keeps beating to a secret rhythm no one else can dictate. Some believe spirituality is serious, solemn, even dull. But real spirituality is deeply playful because it begins by embracing the absurd, the unpredictable, the beautifully ridiculous in being human. Like the day Sophia, a woman in her 40s and a successful executive at a New York finance firm, found enlightenment in the middle of a failed meditation. Sophia had been chasing clarity for years, through serious books, intense courses, and silent retreats in India. But one morning, while listening to a guided meditation in her minimalist Manhattan apartment, the ritual broke. Her neighbor, a young aspiring musician she regularly judged for his complete lack of talent, began blasting an off-key version of Despacito. At first, Sophia tried to resist. She clung to the deep, soothing voice in her headphones. Breathe. Accept what is. But Despacito kept playing. Louder, worse, more insistent. The voice said, "Find calm amidst chaos." And Sophia, fists clenched, was on the verge of screaming every spiritually incorrect insult she knew. And then magic happened. The deep voice cut off. Her phone battery had died. In the sudden silence, Sophia heard herself curse aloud. And then, without knowing how or why, she burst out laughing. A wild, absurd, freeing laugh. She laughed at herself, at her shattered expectations, at her disastrous neighbor, at her attempt to find enlightenment in the middle of the most ridiculous noise. And that laugh, completely unspiritual in any traditional sense, was more illuminating than all her retreats and silent vows. From that moment on, Sophia began to see spirituality from a different angle. She didn't abandon her path. She simply understood she had been seeking it in the wrong way. Life wasn't asking her to be serious all the time. It didn't want her to reach flawless perfection. Life wanted authenticity, brutal honesty about what she felt, thought, and was, even if that meant laughing like crazy during a failed meditation to the tune of a terrible Despacito cover. Curiously, after that, Sophia started enjoying simpler things, including her neighbor's off-key performances. Sometimes she even caught herself humming Despacito while making her morning coffee. Her co-workers noticed a strange but pleasant change. The serious, efficient manager now smiled more, judged less, and seemed more present. She had learned she didn't need to escape the world to find spiritual clarity. She only had to embrace it as it was, imperfect, absurd, full of unpredictable noise. And isn't that the real essence of spirituality? Learning to laugh with what you can't control, embracing the absurd, the unexpected, the inevitably human, and still being able to enjoy it? Sometimes we think spirituality is what pulls us away from the noise of the world, but maybe it's what pulls us closer to it, with joy, intelligent humor, and deep laughter. In accepting what is, Sophia came to understand something crucial about her shadow. She couldn't erase her impatience, her intolerance, her need to control, but she could laugh at them. She could acknowledge them without shame. She could observe them without letting them define her. And that was when her true spiritual journey began, the day she chose to live authentically, not perfectly. The day she understood that to be enlightened, you first have to laugh, really laugh, at the most imperfect parts of yourself. Because the moon, as beautiful and full as it is, also has a dark side it never shows. And Sophia had decided that if the moon could be admired while only revealing half of herself, she too could live peacefully with her own hidden side. No shame, no guilt, no fake perfection. She began to live lighter, more honestly, more freely. Because when the moon wasn't watching, when no one was judging, she no longer needed to pretend to be anything other than who she was. She simply allowed herself to be human. And that, perhaps, is the most spiritual thing a person can do. Now imagine, for just a moment, that you pause and look back on everything you've lived, everything you've done, felt, learned, And instead of chasing more answers, you simply stop and accept who you already are. You are enough. And right here, in this very moment, you realize you already have everything you need. You don't have to keep running. You don't have to live in the future, because the future, in truth, does not exist. There is only now. The world has taught you that you must strive, achieve, accumulate. But that pursuit only takes you farther from what you already are. The first step in walking the path of light is to accept who you are, without masks, without barriers, without judgment, just being what you are, right now, in this moment. Because light is not something you achieve. It's not earned through effort. Light is something you recognize. It is not outside of you. It is within you, and it always has been, waiting to be seen. Why search outside for what you already hold inside? Why insist on becoming more when you, as you are already enough? When we are born, everything is wonder, everything is new. A child doesn't judge what it sees. A child simply sees, feels, delights. But as we grow, we begin to view the world through filters. We're told what to do, what to pursue, what to become. And in that process, we forget that the real power lies in simply being. A child plays because it has no fear. An adult hesitates because it fears not being enough. And all we must do is remember. Remember that light is not something to chase. Light is something to remember. Today, brother, sister, on this journey we've come to remind you, you don't need to become more. You are already perfect just as you are. The light you're searching for is in you, but the only way to find it is to stop looking outside, to look within, to feel yourself, to breathe yourself, to accept that you already are what you've been seeking. Because love, peace, and light are not destinations. They are states that already live within you. The journey begins the moment you realize that all you are is already enough. And once you understand that, everything you do from then on will be an expression of that light. No more running, no more searching, just living. And living is enough. In a corner of the world where few ever look, something happened that's worth remembering. There was silence, a lot of silence. Not the noble kind that comes with sacred spaces, but that other kind, the tense kind, the kind that smells like effort. In a yoga studio decorated with artificial plants, Tibetan bowls, and inspirational quotes carved into wood, a group of people was trying to find something that resembled peace. Among them, a woman with a focused face and a tightly held core stretched into downward-facing dog. Inhale, hold, exhale, and then she farted. It wasn't a polite, nearly inaudible whisper. It was short, honest, clear, the kind of sound no mantra can cover. For a moment, everything froze. No one laughed. No one moved. But then she, the one who had done it, did something that shook the room harder than any yoga pose. She began to laugh. First with her lips pressed together, then without restraint. An unexpected laugh, wild and absurd. She tried to apologize, but couldn't. She doubled over in laughter. And then something even stranger happened. Someone else laughed. Then another. And in less than a minute, the studio cracked wide open, not with judgment, with freedom, with... The room burst into laughter. The instructor, still trying to maintain a calm voice, closed his eyes in surrender. Someone collapsed onto the mat. A woman let out a high-pitched laugh that seemed to purify the air of all that fake serenity. The laughter became liberation. What started as a moment of embarrassment turned into something far deeper. A spiritual experience with no spiritual intention. A surrender with no instructions. No one left that class wiser, but many left lighter, more real, because something had cracked open. And it wasn't the respect, the discipline, or the harmony. It was the pressure, the mask. That woman who had spent years accumulating tension in the form of motivational quotes, breathing techniques, and perfect postures, discovered that her deepest healing came unannounced. Her body spoke for her. The laughter was the visible symptom of a crack opening exactly where she had tried to hold it all together. It wasn't an ordinary moment. It was a threshold. Because deep down, everyone in that room knew what was happening. Someone let go. And because of that, they could too. Spirituality often wears white. It whispers. It walks slowly. And sometimes it forgets how to laugh. But real spirituality, the kind that transforms, is the one that can handle a burst of laughter without feeling insulted. It knows that an unruly fart can release more than an hour of forced meditation. It understands that when the body breaks protocol, the soul breathes. Laughter is an ancient language, older than fear. It appears when something falls out of place, when the script is forgotten, when control grows tired. And right there, in that unscripted moment, truth sneaks in. For years, that woman had studied every technique to raise her vibration. She had memorized affirmations, read about biological decoding, practiced mindfulness with military precision. But never, not once, had she felt as human, as free, as herself, as on the day she let one slip in the middle of sacred silence and ended up crying with laughter in front of strangers. The soul doesn't need solemnity to reveal itself. It only needs permission. After that class, something shifted. Not in her body, in her gaze. She started looking at her imperfections with more tenderness. She stopped speaking like a self-help book. She lived less concerned about seeming centered and more focused on actually being present, even if that meant laughing when no one else did, even if it meant not taking her contradictions so seriously. The world is full of people pretending to be okay, meditating out of obligation, smiling on emotional autopilot. But peace doesn't come from stockpiling techniques. It comes when tension surrenders. And sometimes that surrender takes the shape of an unexpected laugh. Not laughter as mockery, but as a sacred rite, a crack, a revelation. History has often been written through control, through the pursuit of perfection, through the relentless will to become better. But what truly saves us doesn't always look like a teacher. Sometimes it looks like a mistake, a clumsy moment, a ridiculous scene that turns into a blessing without anyone planning it. That day, the woman stopped demanding so much of herself. She started writing letters she would never send, eating without counting calories, saying, "I don't feel like it," without guilt, looking at her reflection with love, even when the mirror didn't offer her best angle. She realized authenticity wasn't a goal, it was a practice. And every time she laughed honestly, without permission, without context, without fear, it was a prayer. No spiritual retreat had offered her so much. No inspiring quote had taught her so much. No mantra had reached as deep as that laughter that dismantled a lifetime of stored-up tension. Because in that moment she understood, there is no shame in being human. There's only misunderstood beauty. When the body laughs, the soul celebrates. Because finally, someone has stopped pretending. Because finally, someone has allowed themselves to be. And that, in its essence, is the highest spiritual practice there is, to be without adornment, to laugh without a filter, to live without fear of looking ridiculous. Laughter became her new mirror. She began to remember how many times she had laughed on the inside but not on the outside. How many times she had wanted to let go in the middle of a meeting, a fake conversation, a hollow toast, and didn't. And the saddest part wasn't what she repressed, but that she had started believing that the repressed version was her real one, until her own body said otherwise. After that class, she went home with a light in her eyes. Not the glow of enlightenment, nor the shimmer of a mystical revelation. Just the unmistakable brightness of being fully, vibrantly human. She looked at herself in the mirror with an unfamiliar expression, not radiant, not defeated, something new, something closer to being awake, as if she had finally remembered that being spiritual is not the same as looking balanced, that there's more truth in a spontaneous laugh than in 100 forced affirmations. Laughter doesn't need permission. It doesn't need meaning either, just space. And in her life, there had been too many airless rooms, too many rehearsed lines, too much misunderstood emotional intelligence, as if everything had to be justified, explained, approved, as if being human was a never-ending project, a beta version in progress. That burst of laughter brought her soul back to the surface. It reminded her that perfection doesn't inspire. What truly inspires is what falls and rises again, laughing. A few days later, she gathered the courage to share the story with a meditation group she'd been attending for years. She expected judgment, awkward silence. But when she said it out loud, when she pronounced the words, "I farted in downward dog," the group laughed, first with embarrassment, then with camaraderie. And suddenly, as if everyone had been waiting for that moment, they started sharing their own little disasters along the path to peace. Someone admitted to falling asleep during a meditation and snoring so loudly he woke the entire group. Another woman said she once burst into uncontrollable laughter during a silent retreat because someone sneezed 5 times in a row while they were walking barefoot through the forest. These weren't stories of failure. They were stories of truth, tiny cracks where life slipped through, and everyone welcomed them with a kind of relief that couldn't be faked. There is nothing more exhausting than trying to look awakened all the time. And there is nothing more healing than laughing when you fail at the attempt. That's when she understood. Laughter is a crack in the mask, a thin line in the character we pretend to be. And through that line, tenderness finds its way in, because no one laughs sincerely while still performing. Laughter asks you to drop your shoulders, let go of the script, and allow yourself to be ridiculous without feeling like you're losing something. Because what you're really losing is only the lie. From that day on, her spirituality took on a new shape. She no longer looked for it in best-selling books or solemn teachings. She found it in the absurd, in the unpredictable, in the clumsy way someone tried to sound profound and ended up stating something obvious with the face of a Zen master. And instead of judging, she laughed. Not at them, with them. Because now she knew, we're all just trying to remember something we forgot while pretending to be grown-ups. True spiritual practice doesn't need complex phrases. Sometimes it's enough to remember that not everything has to be deep to be sacred, that a poorly served coffee, a message sent to the wrong group, or a shirt worn inside out can be the most direct path to the present moment, if you laugh, if you let go, if you accept. There are people who seem to shine, but it's a polished, contained, educated kind of light. And there are others who don't shine. They ignite. Not because they have all the answers, but because they laugh with their soul, at themselves, at life, at the world, at everything they once tried to control. Leonardo never imagined that an improvised astronomy class taught by a grumpy, retired professor at a community center in Barcelona would lead him to the most profound revelation of his life. The professor, a cranky old man named Arturo, had a gravelly voice and a spirit worn out from teaching the same things over and over to students more interested in their phones than the infinite sky. Arturo spoke of the moon with the weary passion of someone who had repeated the same lines 1,000 times without anyone truly listening. Until one day, he said something that captured Leonardo's attention forever. The moon has no light of its own. Its beauty depends entirely on its ability to reflect the sun. But here's the curious thing, he added in a low, almost conspiratorial voice. To show us that reflected light, the moon must always accept that half of itself remains in shadow. Leonardo felt as if those words had been spoken just for him. How long had he been trying to shine while hiding the parts he didn't want anyone to see? How much energy had he spent disguising his shadow in an effort to appear always radiant and accepted? For the first time, the moon stopped being a cold, distant object and became a massive mirror hanging in the sky, revealing something essential about his own life. That night, Leonardo walked slowly out of the community center, gazing at the moon with newfound reverence. He remembered its phases, so much like our own. The new moon, hidden, invisible, shy, like the times he was afraid to show up as his authentic self. Then the waxing crescent, those moments when he gathered courage and began to reveal just a sliver of who he really was, cautiously, like someone dipping their toes into cold water before deciding whether to jump. Then came the full moon, the moment he dared to be entirely himself, when he felt admired, accepted, loved. But that fullness never lasted long, because soon the waning phase arrived, the slow, inevitable retreat of the light. When he began hiding his shadows again for fear of rejection, when he regretted having revealed too much, too human, too vulnerable, too real. How many cycles had he already lived like that, repeating the same dance of light and shadow without ever truly understanding it? He walked for a long time through the damp, glistening streets of Barcelona, watching people laugh, shout, love, argue in the overflowing bars. And in every face, he saw the same lunar phases he experienced within himself. Each person was a new moon when hiding behind a fake smile, a crescent moon when shyly revealing their dreams, a full moon when loving wildly and showing up unguarded, and a waning moon when retreating once more into the safe but sorrowful shelter of their own shadow. Leonardo paused in front of a shop window that reflected his silhouette under the glow of the streetlights. For the first time, he looked at himself without judgment. He saw himself imperfect, tired, alive. He observed his own reflection and thought about all the years he had spent trying to erase his shadow, without realizing that it was precisely that shadow which allowed him to appreciate the light. What would it feel like to live accepting all his phases, without resistance? Could he dare to shine fully, knowing the inevitable price would be to embrace his darkness, without fear, without shame? A few days later, during a casual gathering at a friend's house, the conversation wandered into awkward, hilarious, absurd, and deeply human territory. The moon was in its waxing phase, and someone in the garden brought up an old theory. If the moon affects the tides, could it also affect our moods, our desires, our madness? Everyone laughed except Leonardo. He simply smiled to himself because he already knew the answer. The moon had always stirred his inner tides, his emotional, spiritual, and human currents. Right there, in the middle of casual jokes and light-hearted chatter, Leonardo understood something extraordinary. Human beings need their shadows just as much as the moon needs her hidden side. Don't we love the moon precisely for that secret face she never shows? Isn't that mystery what makes her irresistible? And it was the same with him, and with every person around him. Their shadows were what made them real, interesting, authentic. He remembered his grandmother, who laughed with bitter irony as she cooked recipes no one could replicate. He thought of his friends, hiding deep sadness and uncomfortable truths beneath layers of humor. He recalled fleeting loves that were never perfect, but were real precisely because of their imperfections. He realized that spirituality wasn't about eliminating the shadow. It was about learning to live at peace with it. Because a permanently full moon would be as false and unsustainable as a life that is always radiant and flawless. Real spirituality, Leonardo thought, is learning to live joyfully through all your phases, accepting each one without guilt or regret. On a spontaneous impulse, Leonardo began telling his friends funny stories about his own failures, absurd anecdotes he had always kept hidden. He talked about the time he tried to woo a girl with poetry and forgot the words in front of everyone, the time he went on a spiritual retreat in India and ended up with food poisoning, how he sometimes pretended to receive important calls just to escape awkward conversations. Everyone laughed, and he laughed too, this time without fear or shame. And in that laughter, in allowing himself to be real, in showing his shadow with humor and irony, He felt a kind of lightness he had never known, a deep, spiritual lightness, the kind that comes from fully accepting oneself. That night, walking home under the waxing moon, Leonardo felt that he had finally grasped the art of living, not to eliminate the shadow, but to embrace it with tenderness and humor. Because, he thought, we are all moons. We each have a side we show the world, and another we keep in secret. But when we learn to laugh at our darkness too, when we embrace our hidden side with joy, then, and only then, are we truly free. And so, smiling in silence beneath the moonlight, Leonardo knew he had found the path to his other face, to his truest humanity. An imperfect, beautiful, real humanity. A lunar humanity. That same week, Leonardo was invited to an impromptu dinner at the home of Julia, an old friend who had never believed in any of that spiritual stuff. Julia used to say the closest thing to enlightenment she knew was a well-made mojito at a Cuban bar, with a Buena Vista Social Club song playing in the background. She always claimed spiritual retreats were just fancy ways to run away from oneself, and that the only thing that truly healed the soul was laughing loudly, dancing offbeat, and loving wildly. That night, on a terrace lit with soft lights and paper lanterns, someone asked what everyone would do if they knew it was their last night on Earth. Julia replied immediately, with her usual wit, "I'd regret less and dance more. Then I'd sit down to sip a drink and gaze at the moon, because at least I know she gets me, even when I don't get myself." The table burst into laughter, but Leonardo, watching her, understood that behind that playful answer was a profound truth. Julia had embraced her imperfection, her contradiction, her lunar humanity with humor and honesty. While others debated their last night wishes, Leonardo glanced quietly at the sky. The moon was nearly full, save for a sliver of shadow, reminding him that even in her brightest moments, there's always a corner untouched by light. He remembered something his father once told him when he was a confused teenager. "Son, life's not that complicated, but if you ever feel lost, just look at the moon. She doesn't try to be anything. She simply turns, showing her light and shadow without caring what anyone thinks." Leonardo realized his father had always been a hidden sage, concealed beneath a simple smile and an unpretentious life. That dinner reminded him that true spirituality needs no solemn words, no complicated postures, no manuals on how to achieve peace. Authentic spirituality was happening right there, friends sharing laughter, confessing fears with irony, loving each other in complete imperfection. It was Julia with her gentle sarcasm. It was his father with his quiet wisdom. It was Leonardo himself sitting there finally embracing his whole humanity, his light and his shadow. Midway through the evening, Julia turned up the music and some guests began dancing among bursts of laughter and spontaneous applause. Leonardo, never much of a dancer, felt embarrassed at first. Then he allowed himself to move awkwardly to an old Cuban song. At first, his movements were shy and restrained, until the music slowly entered his body and soul, dissolving resistance, loosening ties, releasing hidden truths that had been buried behind cautious smiles. While she danced, she understood deeply what Julia had meant. Spirituality was nothing more than dancing with life as it is, without hiding the pain or the joy, without pretending everything is always fine, embracing the imperfection of human movement. Dancing meant showing her shadow and her light, her joy and her sadness, her confidence and her awkwardness, without fear. Dancing was being fully human. It was embodying her own lunar phase. That night, walking home slowly under an almost full moon, Leonardo decided to write something he would never forget, a kind of secret manifesto to himself. "I don't want a spirituality that separates me from the world. I want one that makes me dance with it. I don't want enlightenment that erases my shadow. I want one that teaches me to embrace it as an essential part of who I am. I want to laugh when I fail, dance when nothing makes sense, love even when I'm afraid, and live every lunar phase with the joy of knowing that none is better than the others." He pinned the note beside his bedroom mirror, and that very night he slept deeply, with the rare feeling that, for the first time in his life, he had allowed himself to be completely himself. From then on, Leonardo began to live differently. He no longer searched for desperate answers in solemn books or elaborate retreats. Now he looked for answers in coffee shared with Julia, in improvised dinners filled with honest laughter, in clumsy dances under the soft light of the moon. He began to enjoy more, laugh more, accept his humanity without shame. And so, little by little, Leonardo became a full moon to many around him, because he showed both his light and his shadow without fear. He showed that it was possible to be deeply spiritual without distancing oneself from the world, without denying laughter, without rejecting the everyday. He learned that true spirituality was not about ascending to some special state, but descending deeply into oneself, into the human, into the real. He understood that there was no greater wisdom than laughing honestly at his mistakes, dancing awkwardly without fear of judgment, loving without guarantees, and living without perfect plans. Leonardo had finally discovered the moon's deepest secret, that all its beauty and magic came precisely from accepting it would never be fully luminous. Its dark side was part of its eternal charm, and in that moment, beneath an almost full moon in the Barcelona sky, Leonardo felt he had finally found the true art of living, simply dancing gently with life, allowing each phase, each moment, each laugh, each tear, each fear, each dream, without trying to change what he truly was. Because in the end, he thought, smiling silently, perhaps the only real enlightenment is understanding that we have always been the moon, beautifully imperfect beings forever spinning between light and shadow, slowly learning the art of living fully through every phase, unafraid of any of them. And with that quiet certainty, Leonardo decided he would keep dancing until the end of his days, because he no longer feared his hidden side. He now understood that his greatest beauty lived exactly there, in that magical, perfect balance between his shadow and his light. In a corner of the world where spirituality is sold in coffee mugs with motivational quotes and authenticity is marketed in bite-sized reels, a woman named Elisa stood in front of her mirror and chose not to put on makeup, not out of rebellion, not for some aesthetic minimalism, simply because she was tired of pretending to be someone she wasn't, tired of projecting light while her shadow screamed from within. And that day, without a single dab of concealer, she stepped outside with the quiet decision to stop hiding. Elisa was 43, with more failed love stories than living houseplants. Her resume listed 3 languages, 2 master's degrees, and 1 deeper degree in surviving her own self-sabotage. Her therapist said she had an extraordinary ability to intellectualize her pain, but she knew the truth. What she really had was a PhD in not crying in public. Until that day she cried. Not because of something tragic. She cried watching 2 teenagers kiss awkwardly at a subway entrance. She cried because she felt old, invisible. She cried because she remembered her first kiss, that absurd, overwhelming rush of emotion she hadn't felt in years. And in that simple, unfiltered, unseen cry, she felt something strange, relief. A relief that felt holier than all the incense she had ever burned. She sat on a bench, wiped her eyes with a crumpled napkin, and thought, what if I no longer need to pretend I'm an edited version of myself? The question didn't sound like a revelation. It sounded like a door creaking open. That night, she decided to write a list, not of goals, not of things to heal, a list of everything she no longer intended to hide. She wrote, my sadness without cause, my loud laughter, my desire without romance, my inherited guilt, my over-the-top tenderness, my clumsiness at setting boundaries, my need for someone to hug me without asking why. When she finished, she felt alive, raw, beautifully unfinished. For the first time, she didn't feel like a project. She felt like a work in progress, not to be showcased, but to be lived. The days that followed were strange. At times, she felt free. At times, uncomfortable. Sometimes powerful. Sometimes like an emotional teenager trapped in the body of a functional adult. But she no longer betrayed herself. When she wanted to laugh, she laughed. When she needed to cry, she gave herself the silence she needed. When someone asked how she was doing, she sometimes replied, "I don't know, but I'm here." And that was enough. One Thursday afternoon during a work meeting, a colleague described her as a very strong, admirable woman, always composed. She looked at him and said with a half smile, "I'm not composed. I'm held together with emotional duct tape, but thank you for the poetry." The silence was awkward. Then someone let out a timid laugh, and suddenly everyone laughed. They laughed at that unfiltered truth, at that humanity with no pretense. That was when Elisa realized that her vulnerability didn't scare others away. On the contrary, it set them free. From then on, she began writing small reflections and leaving them on scraps of paper around the city, inside elevators, public restrooms, library shelves. Phrases like, "You don't have to be okay all the time. Being alive is already enough. If you can't handle everything today, it's okay. The moon doesn't always shine either. Even your shadow deserves a vacation." One day, walking down the street, she saw a young woman in her 20s reading one of her notes stuck to a lamppost. The girl smiled, tucked it into her pocket, and kept walking. Elisa didn't say a word. She just felt something inside her open like a tired flower receiving sunlight again. And in that moment, she understood. Spirituality wasn't about becoming someone better. It was about stopping the war against who you already are. It was being able to cry watching two teenagers kiss. It was being able to say, "I don't know," without shame. It was writing silly sentences that heal. It was laughing at yourself without losing your dignity. It was understanding that all the phases of your moon are sacred, even the ones you try to hide. The last sentence she ever wrote was, "Don't strive to be a full moon all the time. Learn to love your growing shadow too." And with that, Elisa sealed her new pact with life, to accept her humanity as sacred art, to embrace her chaos as part of the divine rhythm, and to live as someone who no longer needs to pretend she's always shining. Because if she had learned anything, it was that being light doesn't mean outshining others. It means being real even in the dark. And in that, Elisa had already become a moon. And so are you. You just have to remember. You just have to look at yourself without makeup, without judgment, and tell yourself with love, "Here I am, imperfect moon, whole soul." Chapter 2. Your shadow is not an enemy. It's your most honest mirror. In a corner of the world where the word spirituality became trendy and self-love turned into a filter with good lighting, a man named Bruno woke up one morning not knowing why, but with a sensation in his chest like he was late for something he never knew had started. He had everything one is supposed to have to be at peace: a stable partner, a job he didn't hate, friends who laughed at his jokes, a healthy routine with green smoothies and guided meditations. And yet, something was suffocating him. Something that wasn't sadness, but wasn't life either. Something that felt a lot like holding a smile on the outside while secretly wondering when he stopped laughing for real. Bruno didn't consider himself unhappy. He considered himself proper, spiritually proper. He had learned to respond with phrases like, "Everything happens for a reason," "I'm working on myself," or "I'm giving myself permission." But deep down, What he wanted most was to run away without a destination, just to remember what it felt like to move without needing a reason. He'd done therapy, retreats, constellations, breathwork workshops. He'd even paid to have his birth chart read to the sound of a gong. And still, he couldn't fall asleep without feeling that silent ache that arrives just when you turn off your phone, and with it, a part of yourself. One night, while reciting a mantra that no longer meant anything to him, he looked in the bathroom mirror and said it without anesthesia, without voice, without inner makeup. "I'm pretending." It wasn't a complaint. It was a confession, not to anyone else but to himself. And in that moment, without flashing lights or cinematic epiphanies, his shadow appeared, not as a monster, not as a mystical entity, but as a version of himself, more tired, more free, more honest. A version that looked at him like someone waiting to be let inside after years out in the cold. The shadow spoke to him with the loving irony only the parts of ourselves we've silenced can offer. "It's about time." And Bruno understood everything without understanding a thing. The shadow didn't want to destroy him. It wasn't there to take anything away. It had come to remind him of what he'd tried to forget with forced positivity, that there's no real light without visible shadow, no true healing without admitting the wound, no evolution without radical honesty. That night, Bruno didn't sleep, but for the first time he rested, because he stopped lying to himself. He acknowledged his rage, his exhaustion, his craving to scream or walk away from everything for 5 minutes and stop being the elevated man everyone expected. He remembered that he once dreamed of being a musician, but never said so because it wasn't practical. That he fell in love with someone who didn't fit his perfect life, and so he chose what was safe over what was alive. That he had thoughts he labeled unspiritual when, in truth, they were just human. He allowed himself to think the unthinkable, that he didn't want to be enlightened. He just wanted to be happy for a while without a divine plan hanging over his head. And that, far from pulling him off his path, placed him right at its center. The shadow is that part of you that doesn't care about likes, the one that sits with you when nothing's going right, the one that laughs when you pretend you're at peace while all you really want is a hug or to scream, the one that shows up when you let your guard down and speak the truth, even if it's not pretty. The shadow is not the enemy. It is your most honest mirror, the one that doesn't applaud but never abandons you either, the one that doesn't need you to be perfect, only real. From that night on, Bruno stopped repeating mantras he no longer felt. He began to write his own prayers, little unrhymed poems that said things like, "Today, I don't feel like saving the world. I just want to eat breakfast without guilt." He started saying no without explaining himself so much, crying without timing it, laughing loudly when something moved him, even if it wasn't elevated. He began living closer to his shadow, not because he liked everything he saw in it, but because he realized there was love there too. Love without conditions, love without makeup, love without a script. True spirituality doesn't seek perfection. It seeks presence. It's not a performance, it's a refuge. It's not a personal brand, it's a return to the soul. And the soul doesn't need you to be a better version of yourself. It needs you to be you, unedited, unjustified, unhidden. Because right there, in what you want to delete, in what you don't want to show, in what you're ashamed to admit, is the threshold. Not to become someone else, but to finally embrace yourself. Bruno began to walk differently, not because he floated, but because he stopped dragging himself. His posture wasn't that of a guru, it was that of a reconciled human. His light wasn't brighter, it was more honest. And his shadow, far from disappearing, now walked beside him like a friend who doesn't demand, doesn't impose, just accompanies. Because there was nothing left to hide. Some people noticed the change. They told him he looked lighter, freer. He didn't know how to explain it, so he just smiled and said, "I'm sleeping better." No one suspected that what he was really doing was living better, because he had finally allowed himself to be all his pieces, not just the ones that matched the image others had of him, also the chaotic ones, the intense ones, the broken ones. And you, reading this, you know, because you feel it, because you're also tired of pretending everything's in order. And maybe you don't need to do anything more than this. Whisper the truth and let your shadow hear it. Not to stay there, but to enter, to look, to breathe, and to embrace yourself without conditions. Your shadow is not your enemy. It is your most forgotten, most ancient, most alive part. It doesn't need to be tamed. It only needs you to open the door and gently say, "You can stay. I'm not going to run." Because today, at last, I've chosen to stop shining at the cost of denying you. And that, brother, is the most spiritual act anyone can commit. To stop shining in order to begin lighting up from within, without fear of the night, without fear of the moon, without fear of oneself. Because light that does not embrace its own shadow is not light, it is a facade. Esteban didn't know whether he wanted to cry or set fire to his quartz altar. That morning, after a ridiculous argument with his partner about who forgot to turn off the faucet, he felt all his chakras collapse. Not the Palo Santo, not the Tibetan incense, not his looping mantra playlist could stop the internal storm. And so he found himself standing in front of the mirror, disheveled with dark circles under his eyes, muttering, "I'm a fraud." Not because he was lying, but because he was exhausted from sustaining a character who never sweated, never doubted, never shouted. A character who never ate bread after 8 or thought anything inappropriate. Esteban had turned his spiritual path into a performance. For months he had repeated that everything was perfect, that the universe always knew best, that the mirror was the master. And yet, every time he was alone, he felt something deeply sad inside him. Not dramatic sadness, not violins and rain sadness, subtle sadness, like a whisper, like when you're surrounded by people who admire you, but no one hugs you unless you ask. Sadness of someone who lives to inspire others but no longer knows how to inspire himself. Esteban was the accidental guru of his group, the one everyone turned to, the one who knew all about masculine and feminine energy, ancestral wounds, constellations, and biodecoding. But he no longer knew how to breathe with ease, only with technique. One night, in the middle of his forced gratitude routine, something unexpected happened. He had enough. He closed his eyes, inhaled as always, and instead of saying, "Thank you, universe," he said, "I'm tired." He said it softly, like tossing a stone into water and hoping no one noticed. But the echo was immediate, because his shadow, long waiting, sprang up like a startled cat, tired of always having to be okay. Tired of hiding the envy he felt when someone else succeeded before he did. Tired of not being able to get angry without losing credibility. Tired of not being able to say, "I have no idea," when everyone expected elevated answers. That night, Esteban did something even more outrageous. He allowed himself to laugh at himself, at his diet, at his favorite prophet, at his compulsive need to turn every bad moment into a lesson. And that laugh was divine, not because it was loud, but because it was honest, like an emotional sneeze, like a first breath outside the character, like a crack through which something finally entered that didn't arrive in the form of should. And in that moment, he understood. The spirituality that had once saved him was now trapping him. Because without realizing it, Esteban had done what he swore he never would. He had exiled himself from his humanity. He had turned the practice into dogma, awareness into obligation, and he had become a prisoner of an ideal version of himself, perfectly clean, impeccably conscious, infinitely tired. The next day, he decided to speak to his community. He wrote a sincere message, No lotus emojis, no Einstein quotes, no hashtags. He simply said, "I'm tired of being an example. Today I have nothing to teach. I just want to be human, with all my contradictions." Some unfollowed. Others sent heart emojis, but one, just one, replied with something that changed his view forever. "Thank you for showing me it's okay to fall. You made me feel less alone." And then he realized that healing spirituality is not the kind that lifts you above the world. It's the one that plunges you deeper into it, the one that gets your hands dirty, that cries while doing the dishes, that screams doubts, loves from the mess. Because being spiritual doesn't mean being shadowless. It means being able to face your shadow without fear. It's not about eliminating your contradictions. It's about stopping the judgment. From that moment, Esteban stopped trying to be a lighthouse and started being fire. Fire that warms, fire that burns, fire that consumes what no longer serves. He wasn't less wise for it. He was more real. And it's with what's real, brother, that hearts catch flame. He stopped posting quotes on autopilot. He began writing uncomfortable truths. He stopped pretending his partner was his cosmic complement and started calling her by her name, Lucia, a woman who loved him but also challenged him. He stopped saying, "Everything is a lesson" every time something went wrong. Sometimes he just said, "This is shit." And that phrase, spoken in truth, healed him more than any positive affirmation. Sometimes, during workshops, someone would ask why he no longer seemed so enlightened, and he would reply with a smile, "Because I'm more alive than ever." Because there is something deeply liberating about letting go of the idea of purity. Purity is the cruelest expectation. It forces you to cleanse yourself of the very things that make you human, your chaos. And without chaos, there is no creation. And without creation, there is no soul. That's why Esteban now begins his classes by saying, "I'm not here to teach you how to be better. I'm here to remind you that being human is already miraculous." And in that reminder, tears mix with laughter. Because finally, someone dares to say it without fear. Spirituality is not a summit to climb. It is ground to return to. And when you return, when you meet again with your uncomfortable side, when there is no longer a need to defend yourself, then the real leap happens. You embrace yourself entirely. And then, yes, then you are light. But a light that doesn't believe itself better than anyone. A light that embraces the mud, because that's where it was born. The first time Renata realized she desired something she shouldn't, she was 8 years old. She was at Mass with her grandmother, wearing an itchy embroidered dress that pinched, forced to sit still while someone talked about purity, sacrifice, and the need to contain one's impulses. Renata didn't understand much, but she did know one thing. She wanted to laugh, a silly, childish, irrepressible laugh, like a burst of life that didn't fit inside her. She held it back, bit her lips, and felt a sting in her stomach. Her grandmother gave her that look. God is watching. And Renata understood, without anyone explaining it, that desire, even one as simple as laughing in the middle of silence, was a threat to what's correct. Years passed, and that seed of self-censorship grew with her. She learned to desire in silence, to not show too much excitement for the things that stirred her body, to shrink her longings, to polish her passions. She learned to become a presentable version of herself, the one that doesn't disturb, doesn't get messy, doesn't make mistakes, doesn't ask for anything too intensely. And she succeeded. She became the perfect woman, successful, admired, with a life that looked flawless from the outside, but on the inside felt like a white room without furniture, impeccable, but soulless. Until one day, standing by a window after a ridiculous conversation about whether using a peach emoji in professional context was appropriate, Renata had enough. It wasn't a crisis. It wasn't an epiphany. It was something simpler. She asked herself, what am I giving up to keep this image alive? And the answer came like a jolt. Everything. The spontaneous laughter, the ridiculous dancing, the desire, the fire, that part of her that never asked for permission to exist. And in that moment, she didn't see herself as a victim of a repressive culture, but as a silent accomplice in her own dimming. That night, Renata lit a candle in her room, not because she believed in rituals, but because she needed to see fire with her own eyes. She sat in front of the mirror, slowly removed her makeup, and said to herself, "I'm alive, and I'm hungry." It wasn't hunger for food. It was hunger for truth, for body, for joy, for being able to say, "I like this. I want more of this," even if it's not elevated, even if it's not elegant, even if it's not validated by any ancestral practice. Desire, she thought, is not the enemy. It is the soul's language when it wants to expand. What taints it is not its existence, but the guilt we drape over it. Because we were taught that desire equals lack, weakness, flaw. But no one told us that desire is also art, creative force, music, beauty, connection. No one told us desire can be a wordless prayer. In the days that followed, Renata allowed herself to want things without justification. She bought that shiny dress she always thought was too much. She danced alone in her living room to songs she had hidden in secret playlists. She said, "I don't want to talk," when she didn't feel like it. She said, "I want to see you," without disguising desire as emotional need. She stopped pretending that sex was either a biological function or a spiritual ceremony. She understood it could simply be pleasure for pleasure's sake, body to body, soul to soul, without guilt, without contracts, without rituals. That's when everything became clear. Desire is not something to be controlled, but something to be understood. It is not something you conquer, but something you transform. Because behind every honest desire is a part of you that wants to wake up. There is a spark waiting to be seen. Not every desire leads to expansion, it's true. Some are born from emptiness. But many others arise from abundance. And if we learn to tell them apart, we stop being afraid of them. Renata began writing in a notebook she titled "Without Shame." Each night she would jot down her uncensored desires. Some were deep, to be seen without judgment. Others were simple, to eat with her hands. Some were intense, to fall in love again without strategy. Others were so intimate they couldn't be written without blushing. But the content wasn't what mattered. It was the permission, the act of telling herself, "I want," without needing to ask if it was allowed. One evening, she shared the practice with her friends over dinner. At first, they laughed. Then one dared to share something. Then another. What followed was a celebration of everything that's never spoken aloud: cravings, fears, pleasures, pain, dreams, fantasies, contradictions. When they finished, one of them said, "This was more liberating than years of yoga." And it wasn't to dismiss the practice. It was because, finally, someone had lit the fire without being afraid to burn. Renata then understood that desire is not a detour from the spiritual path. It is part of the path. It's the trail that leads you back to yourself. Sometimes it burns. Sometimes it disrupts. But it always reveals. We are not here to extinguish that fire. We are here to know it, to dance with it, to transform it, to listen when it whispers, "This is what makes you vibrate." The problem was never desire. The problem was confusing repression with virtue. But the soul does not want repression. It wants coherence. It wants tenderness. It wants to dance in a body that knows what it feels. And that, brother, that is spiritual. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. There is nothing more sacred than a human being at peace with their desire. Not the tame desire dressed up as purpose, nor the hunger driven by emptiness, but the real, clear desire that says, "This moves me, this lights me up, this connects me with my most vibrant humanity, And if that's a sin, then let the dogmas burn. That night, Renata closed her notebook while staring into the candle's flame, smiling. I am fire, and I will no longer apologize for being lit. Because she finally understood that life is not waiting for purity, it is waiting for passion. And there is nothing more spiritual than being set ablaze in the name of love, joy, and truth, even when you don't know exactly where it will lead you. Some mornings aren't meant to start. Not because something tragic has happened, not because the world is ending, but because life feels like a sock worn wrong. Everything is in its place, but something rubs, pinches, feels off. That was Matteo's morning. He opened his eyes and instantly knew something wasn't going to fit. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't anxiety. It was one of those nameless sensations, like a cloud that never rains but also doesn't drift away. He got up in silence, avoided the mirror like it owed him an explanation, and poured himself coffee even though he didn't want it. He did it out of habit, like someone performing a dance they no longer understand. Matteo was one of those people who had tried everything: therapy, books, self-esteem workshops, astrological charts, gratitude lists, affirmations in the mirror that ended with a forced, echo-less, "You got this." He knew how to speak kindly to himself, but none of the motivational phrases rang true. He had built a functional version of himself, but behind that polished mask still lived a kid with untied shoelaces and feelings on his sleeve. He didn't want healing. He wanted understanding. He didn't want to ascend. He wanted at last to feel like he belonged, without needing to pretend. That morning, on a whim, he walked into a local bookstore, one of those that smells like old dust and silence. He stood before the shelves, unsure of what he was looking for, until a book fell, literally, on its own. It slid and landed at his feet. The title was strange: Everything is Okay, Even If It Doesn't Seem Like It. He opened it randomly and read, "You are not broken. You are just a little out of order, like a song still finding its rhythm, like a room with books out of place that is still, somehow, home." Matteo smiled for the first time in days, not because of the book itself, but because, in that one sentence, he felt someone was finally speaking to him in a language that didn't demand improvement, only presence. He went home with the book under his arm, like someone holding a handwritten note from someone who had known him forever. He read it slowly, without rushing, and each page told him something he hadn't realized he needed to hear. You don't have to be okay all the time. You don't have to be coherent every day. You don't have to shine constantly. Sometimes, you just need to let yourself be, to curl up on the couch with a lump in your throat and not demand an explanation from that lump. From that point on, Matteo began a new list, not of goals, not of affirmations, a list of broken things he still found beautiful: his favorite mug with a crack, a slightly off-key song that reminded him of his teenage years, a poorly written poem scrawled on a napkin in a bar, his way of loving, awkward but intense, his silences during conversations he didn't know how to hold, his causeless Sunday sadness, his need for affection, for touch, for understanding, his undisciplined chaos, his mistimed tenderness. And in that list, Matteo began to recognize himself, not as an unfinished project, but as a being in transit. He understood that his value wasn't in arriving whole anywhere, but in being able to look at his scattered pieces with compassion, that he didn't need to piece himself together like a perfect puzzle. He could be a collage, a loose part, a story without an ending. The spirituality that had pursued him for years now revealed itself in a different way, not as a path toward a higher self, but as a tender return to the self he'd always been. The one who cried for no reason, laughed at the wrong moments, contradicted himself, who sometimes didn't want to see anyone and other times wanted to embrace the entire world. He began to honor his messiness as part of his identity, not as a flaw, but as texture, as his own rhythm. One afternoon, while walking through the park, he saw a little girl wearing a dress covered in paint stains. She didn't seem to notice. She ran, laughed, rolled in the grass without a care for her clothes. Her mother, instead of correcting her, looked on with a mix of resignation and pride. And Mateo understood something simple yet profound. No one asks a child to be complete in order to be loved. So why did he ask that of himself? When he got home, he wrote a note on his mirror. "You're not here to arrive whole. You're here to feel whole while still in pieces." And that phrase sank into his skin. He began to repeat it every time he felt like he wasn't enough, every time he compared himself, every time he demanded himself to be something he wasn't. Slowly, his routine changed, not out of discipline but out of tenderness. He allowed himself to have unproductive days. He allowed himself to rest without guilt. He listened to music that healed nothing but reminded him of someone he had loved. He gave himself permission not to transform, just to live. And in that not doing, he began to transform, as if releasing the pressure had freed him from some invisible chain. He started writing letters he never sent. He spoke more slowly, said, "I don't know," without shame, asked for help, said, "I feel weird," instead of pretending everything was under control. And that, brother, that was his quantum leap, not upward, inward. Because real spirituality doesn't lift you to the heavens. It brings you down into your body. It settles you in your flesh. It returns you to your own rhythm. It whispers, "You are alive," even if you don't know what to do with that yet. Mateo no longer defines himself by what he lacks. He defines himself by what he allows. He allows himself to not understand everything. He allows himself to love without guarantees. He allows himself to sleep without closing chapters. He allows himself to desire without a map. And in that silent permission, he found what he'd been searching for in books, in workshops, in other people's phrases, the peace of not needing to be whole in order to deserve being. Elena used to wake up early, not because she liked mornings, but because she couldn't stand the feeling of being late to life. There was always something in her that rushed ahead. One more idea, one more goal, one more improvement waiting. She had read more self-help books than novels and could recite the stages of grief, trauma phases, and emotional healing techniques by heart. But for some reason, she still felt like a guest in her own home, as if she didn't yet have permission to take off her shoes and stay. Every day was a new attempt to be the best version of herself. Conscious breathing exercises, mindful eating, spiritual practices that left her more anxious than calm, visualizations of the future that triggered headaches. No positive affirmation could soothe. Spirituality promised her wholeness, but it was only making her feel guilty. Guilty for not always being aligned. Guilty for not being completely over her ex. Guilty for feeling lonely after meditation. Guilty for wanting to quit all of it once and for all. One Tuesday afternoon, after a so-called energetic reconnection workshop that ended with a PowerPoint full of badly translated quotes, Elena stopped. Literally. She sat down on the curb between a pizza place and a copy shop, and she cried. Not dramatically, not with bitterness, just exhaustion. An honest, simple cry, like opening the faucet of the soul and letting it run, without asking whether the water was clean. There, with smeared mascara and an exposed heart, she said to herself for the first time, "I'm tired of trying to be light if it means denying myself." She wasn't tired of growing. She was tired of growing by force, of having to seem strong when all she needed was a long, wordless hug, of pretending that everything was a lesson when sometimes it just hurt. She allowed herself to say it softly, like confessing a forbidden truth. But it wasn't forbidden. It was real. From that moment on, she began living with more presence and less pretense. She allowed her house to be messy without feeling less spiritual because of it. She drank wine without justifying it with ancestral rituals. She watched ridiculous comedies without looking for a deeper message. She stopped spiritualizing pain. She began saying things like, "I feel bad and I have no idea why," and discovered that people didn't run away. They moved closer. Elena realized her humanity wasn't a flaw in the system. It was the system itself. That her need for love, touch, and tenderness wasn't a sign of low vibration. It was a reminder that light isn't about floating above everything. Light is the reflection of being right here, feeling it all. Every crack, every desire, every awkward gesture, every impulse that doesn't fit into any method but pulses with real life. She started doing something new, celebrating her contradiction, writing poems without structure, admitting she sometimes believed in nothing, recognizing that the soul also gets bored when everything is too perfect. One day she looked in the mirror and, instead of asking what she should improve, she said, "Thank you for staying, like this, however you are." And for the first time, she didn't feel like she was missing something. She felt whole, even with doubts, even with fears, even with unresolved memories. Spirituality, she realized, is not a place you arrive at. It is the way you inhabit what you already are. Not an image, but an invisible practice. A way of seeing, of being, of embracing without a manual, of crying without a diagnosis, of laughing without explanation, of living without owing anything to anyone. From that moment on, Elena began to cross paths with other humans who were also tired of pretending. People who cried in the kitchen and cracked jokes in the bathroom. People who meditated poorly, forgot birthdays, hurt others without meaning to, but always returned with an open heart. People who longed to love without formulas. People who didn't want to be perfect. They wanted to be free. And in those encounters, spirituality kept showing up, not in robes or flashing lights, but in unexpected hugs, in laughter that leapt over judgment, in glances that said, "Me too." Because the real path isn't upward, it's inward. And when you go in with everything, not just the pretty parts, but also the broken ones, the ones still not understood, the ones still aching for warmth. One day, Elena found an old note tucked inside a book. She didn't remember writing it. It said, "I want a spirituality that doesn't take me away from myself, but brings me back home." She smiled. She didn't need to search for that anymore, because now she was living it. Brother, sister, whoever you are, wherever you are, if you've ever felt you had to be better to deserve peace, if you've ever believed your shadow disqualifies you, if you've ever grown tired of trying to be the perfect version of yourself, breathe, let go, close your eyes, and hear this with your whole body. Your humanity is not a flaw. Your chaos is not a punishment. Your story needs no correction. It is here, on this imperfect altar, that your light is born. And it is in your shadow that that light is cast and recognized. Chapter 3. Love looks more like a labyrinth than a promise. In a corner of the world where hugs last less than notifications and love is measured by fast replies, Clara wandered alone through a flower market. She wasn't looking for anything. Sometimes she simply did that, walked without a list, without a goal, like someone allowing herself to be part of the scenery of a life that doesn't need to be explained. Clara was one of those people who had loved deeply and been loved halfway. Not because no one truly cared for her, but because she herself was still learning how to stay when tenderness chose her. That morning, as she smelled a flower she couldn't name, she overheard one woman telling another, "Don't fall in love with the one who claps for you. Fall in love with the one who holds you when you're not presentable." Clara smiled. It was just a phrase. But like all true phrases, it slipped in uninvited. And in that instant, she understood something no one had ever taught her, that real love isn't a spectacle, it's a home. She had spent years believing that to love meant to impress, to keep smiling, to be careful not to show too much. That love was a vertical emotion that lifted you above everything. But at 40, she no longer wanted wings. She wanted roots, not butterflies. She longed for earth, for shared silence. The kind of love that doesn't photograph well but holds steady when everything trembles. That afternoon, she wrote in her journal, "I'm rehearsing love, not the romantic kind, the real kind. The kind that doesn't always say beautiful things but stays. The kind that doesn't need piano chords to be deep. The kind that arrives without a premiere date or exit clause. I'm rehearsing how to love without asking for proof in return, without trying to heal the other, without pressuring myself to always be likable. I'm rehearsing love like someone who tends a garden, knowing the weather won't always help but planting anyway." From then on, Clara began to experience life as a rehearsal for love. Not perfect love, but real love. Sometimes clumsy, sometimes uncomfortable, sometimes interrupted by old wounds that don't announce their return. She started with the small things, greeting people with more attention, not checking her phone while someone spoke, no longer replying quickly when she didn't feel like it, not promising what she couldn't truly sustain. She realized she had often mistaken love for debt. She believed that if someone looked at her tenderly, she owed them something, that if she received love, she had to become worthy of it. Over time, that had made her great at pleasing and terrible at receiving. She began to practice silence, not the punishing kind, but the kind that listens. She listened to her sister repeat the same story for the 4th time without needing to offer a solution. She listened to her mother complain about the humidity without interrupting. She listened to her own body ask for rest without needing an illness to justify it. One day, a man who loved her but didn't know how said, "I don't understand why you're so different now." She replied, "Because I finally understood that loving well doesn't mean trying harder. It means forcing less." He didn't fully understand, but he looked at her with new respect, as if something in his soul recognized that sentence as a way out of the maze, or perhaps as a doorway in. In the same notebook where she scribbled stray thoughts, Clara wrote, "Love is also knowing when to leave if staying means betraying yourself." She didn't write it with sadness. She wrote it like someone signing a pact with herself. From that day on, she stopped asking why someone left. She started asking why she stayed so long in places where her laughter was too loud, her mind too free, her love too whole. One rainy Thursday, while waiting for clothes she'd forgotten to hang to dry, she looked in the mirror and told herself, "Today, I love myself more than yesterday. Not because I'm better, but because I'm hiding less." That night she went to bed without masking her soul, and slept like someone who had forgiven a debt that was never hers to begin with. Because there's something no one tells you in time, that love doesn't mean understanding everything. It's staying even when you understand nothing, but feel that the place you're in is still home. Love is not just the fire that ignites, it's also the water that soothes. And life, that silent, patient teacher, never asks us to be perfect to love. It only asks that we stop pretending. And so, Clara understood that love is not a happy ending. It's an eternal rehearsal, sometimes clumsy, sometimes brilliant, sometimes as messy as a drawer full of letters that were never sent, but always alive, always hers. If you're reading this and feel like you love badly, like you give too much, like you're unsure whether you're nurturing or disappearing, just remember this. Love isn't a choreography you memorize. It's a music you discover in your body, your soul, your moment. And every time you dance with honesty, even if you stumble, even if you hesitate, you're getting closer to what's real. Loving is not about shining for someone else, but about igniting from within without needing an audience. It's walking through the labyrinth without a map, but with courage. And if the heart gets hurt, let it be for having been brave, not for having hidden away. The train was full, not with people, with absences, with lit-up cell phones, half-finished conversations, distant stares crossing paths without ever touching. Camila sat at the back with a grocery bag and a poem lodged in her throat she didn't know how to release. She wasn't a poet. She had never dared to write anything, but there were verses inside her, as if somewhere in her soul lived a woman aching to speak without asking permission. That afternoon, she had just visited her father, a man who once held her like the world was ending, but now looked at her as if she were the one who had already disappeared. She struggled to understand how it was possible to love someone so deeply and still feel that love wasn't strong enough to stop the erosion. As if love alone didn't have the strength to bridge the distance of the unspoken. She thought about this as the train moved forward. She thought about everything she hadn't dared to say, what she wished she could shout to her father, to herself, to the world. Why do we silence what hurts the most? Why do we turn love into a chore, into an occasional visit, into a reminder of what could have been? She closed her eyes, and in her mind, faces, words, silences all blended together. She remembered the first time she cried over love. It was in a movie theater. She was 17. Not because of the film, but because the boy next to her had fallen asleep during a scene she found sublime. She left the theater feeling her intensity was too much. That maybe, as she'd been told before, she felt things too deeply. That idea followed her for years, as if feeling was excessive, as if showing emotion was a flaw that maturity was meant to erase. That afternoon on the train, Camila told herself, "I'm done fixing myself." And it was in that moment right there that she began to write, not on paper, on her body, on her energy, in the way she stepped off the train and took a deep breath like someone being born again. She started walking more slowly, looking at trees as if they were living sculptures, noticing the gestures of strangers. She let herself feel sad without making an internal fuss. She stopped dressing up in positivity when all she really wanted was silence. Camila understood something that would change her life. Wherever everything hurts, beauty is also being born. Because pain, when embraced, transforms, not into instant peace, not into forced wisdom. It transforms into raw material, into sensitivity, into the ability to see what others don't, to hold someone without telling them what to do, to accompany without needing to save. On a random Saturday at a neighborhood fair, she saw a little girl fall while running. The mother bent down to pick her up, and instead of saying it was nothing, she said, "It was something. But you're here. You're still going." That phrase pierced Camila's soul, because it reminded her of all the times she had been told it was nothing, that she was exaggerating, that she was too sensitive, that she shouldn't cry over that. And for the first time, she understood that there's nothing wrong with crying over that we each have our sacred wounds, and to deny them is to deny ourselves. From then on, Camila began to write poems. At first, she didn't show them. Later, she left some on cafe tables she frequented. Simple lines, but sincere. Like, "You're not too much. You're exactly what someone who sees clearly needs." Or, "Sometimes your sadness is just looking for a chair to rest on." One day, a young man approached her holding one of her notes. "Is this yours?" She hesitated, then nodded. The boy looked at her with disarming tenderness. "Thank you. I needed this today." And he walked away. Camila didn't need more than that. Just knowing that her pain, transformed into words, had touched someone else. That her intensity, far from being a flaw, was a lit lamp. And maybe, just maybe, her way of healing was to share what hurt without dressing it up. Sometimes the world seems made for those who don't feel too much, for those who don't stop to stare at a sunset like it's the first time, for those who don't get emotional over a forgotten song, for those who aren't moved by a slow, thoughtful touch. But in truth, the world also needs the others, those who feel deeply, those who cry in silence, those who give hugs with everything they have, those who are not afraid to bleed poetically. Camila no longer wanted to be cured of her sensitivity. She wanted to celebrate it. She no longer sought an explanation for every tear. She sought a space where she could cry without making anyone uncomfortable, where she could love without having to water down her intensity, where she could be herself without needing to apologize for it. Because she had come to understand that the soul doesn't seek coherence, it seeks expression, and that every emotion is a legitimate form of existence. In one of her final handwritten notes, Camila left a message on a park bench. "You're not broken. You're singing in a frequency not everyone can hear yet, but those who do will know it's music." That day, she didn't need anyone to find it. She just needed to know that she no longer owed the world a tamed version of herself, that her love was immense, sometimes painful, sometimes overflowing, but always true. And that, brother, that too is a kind of beauty, one that asks for no permission, one that is born exactly where it once hurt. There are days when you're not sad, you're just out of tune, like a song that doesn't sound quite right because someone moved a tiny knob on the soundboard and everything shifted without you noticing. You've lived so long trying to be correct, presentable, spotless, that you've forgotten what it feels like to be truly alive. Because real life isn't a polished mantra or a social media balance. It's an awkward laugh at a funeral, a tear falling in the checkout line, a guiltless "I don't know" in a boardroom. If it hurts, it's not because something's wrong. It's because something in you is waking up. You're not broken, you're vibrating off key. Like when a vinyl skips right at the most beautiful part of the song, you're starting to recover the original frequency they dimmed in you with praise, pressure, and lines like, "That's not how it's done." Many people were broken by success, not because they were weak, but because they achieved what they were told would make them happy, and weren't. Like Jim Carrey confessing that after earning millions, all he wanted was to disappear. Or like Edith Piaf, singing with a soul reduced to ashes while the audience clapped, not realizing their ovation was just noise against her emptiness. Some people cheer your light, but they couldn't handle your shadow. And yet, the most real part of you lives right there, where applause never reaches. You are not a lost note. You are part of a symphony that is just beginning to tune itself. Shadows don't disappear through enlightenment. They transform through contact. And to touch them, you must stop running. You must stay. You must look fear in the eye and say, "You're invited, but you're no longer driving." Because pain doesn't leave when it's denied. It leaves when it no longer has to scream to be heard. When you sit with it, pour it some tea, and listen without trying to fix it. There's a misconception floating around that being spiritual means rising above your emotions. But no, being spiritual means being able to dive into them without drowning. It means crying without justifying it, saying, "This hurts," without feeling weak, laughing at what once broke you. As Clarice Lispector wrote, "What hurts me most, I write." And that's not masochism, that's alchemy. That's turning wounds into art, chaos into melody, contradiction into beauty. Maybe that's why art remains the highest form of spirituality, because it doesn't aim to please, it aims to reveal. It doesn't guide, it awakens. And you don't need more techniques to be better. You need more fire to be yourself, with all your oddities, with ideas no one understands, with nameless emotions, with contradictions you still haven't figured out. That is your raw material, your voice, your offering. There's a phrase that says, "Be the change you wish to see in the world." But maybe it needs rewriting. Maybe you didn't come here to change the world. Maybe you came to infect it with truth, to show that it's possible to be broken and still sing, to be scared and still speak, to not know who you are and still wrap yourself in an embrace. That too is revolution. That too is sacred. Today isn't about solving everything. It's about no longer hiding. If you cry, do it without guilt. If you laugh, don't cover your mouth. If you don't know, say so without shame. If you love, show it without strategy. And if you doubt, know that even that is part of your soul. Because the soul isn't perfect. It isn't a spotless temple. It is mud. It is laughter. It is impulse. It is desire. It is light and shadow making love while you sleep. And when you wake, you understand. You weren't lost. You were about to be born. Sebastian had a reputation for being tough, the kind of man who never breaks, whether from bad news or sad movies. He was the friend who always knew what to do, who gave advice with a poker face and hugged without squeezing too tight. But something in his gaze gave him away, a sort of inexplicable nostalgia, as if he carried a letter inside he never dared to send. One random Friday, after an uneventful day, he walked into a shop to buy bread and came out with a potted plant. It wasn't pretty. It had a small crack on one side. But something about that crack felt familiar. He took it home without thinking, placed it on the table like someone welcoming a guest, and stared at it for a long time, in silence, until, without knowing why, he said to it, "I get you." It wasn't madness. It was tenderness. It was the first sincere act he'd allowed himself in ages. Because Sebastian wasn't broken. He was restrained. An ocean disguised as a pond. Since childhood, he'd learned that crying wasn't practical, that sensitivity should only be used if it served others. He'd spent his life taking care of everyone, but never learned how to let himself be cared for. That night he dreamed he was carrying a child in his arms. The child had his face, only smaller, sadder. He rocked him, but the child wouldn't sleep. He whispered, "I just wanted someone to listen." When Sebastian woke up, he didn't make a dramatic move. He sat down. He breathed. And for the first time, he wrote a letter to that child. Not a therapeutic letter, a real one. From man to boy, from him to himself. "I'm sorry I didn't hug you more, for silencing you when you wanted to cry, for making you strong too soon, for demanding too much, for forgetting you were there. I see you. I hear you. I'm starting to love you, even if it's hard." He put the letter in a drawer, but he didn't hide himself anymore. He began to show his tenderness in small ways. A message sent late, an "I miss you" without context. A silence that didn't end conversations but deepened them. A tear he didn't hide when he saw his dog sleeping on the couch. People began to notice a change, not weakness, humanity, closeness, realness, because there's something in tenderness that tears down walls without needing to demolish them. Sebastian didn't change how he spoke. He changed how he stayed. He no longer ran from affection. Nor did he over-explain it. He started giving full embraces, listening without crafting a reply, crying without rushing to stop. One day, his father, a man as guarded as he used to be, said on the phone, "Sometimes I feel like I don't know how to love you right." And instead of justifying or saying, "It's okay," Sebastian simply replied, "You're starting," by saying it. And in that moment, something ancient broke. Something passed down through generations. Something that said men are only strong when they feel nothing. Sebastian had just proven the opposite. From then on, he wrote small notes and left them in unexpected places. It's okay not to have the answer. You don't need to be useful to be loved. Your tenderness isn't weakness, it's strength in its purest form. He left them in mailboxes, library books, coffee shop napkins, never signed them, but his signature was in the intention. One afternoon he crossed paths with a woman in the park. She was crying, unashamed. He sat nearby, not too close, and after a while said without looking, "Sometimes crying in front of others is a way of saying, 'I'm real too.'" She nodded. They didn't speak again. But when she left him a folded piece of paper on the bench. It said, "Thank you for not saving me, just for being here." Sebastian didn't need more proof. The tenderness he had once feared turned out to be his greatest gift, Because in a world that glorifies hardness, those who allow themselves to feel are revolutionaries. In a society that prizes efficiency, those who pause to see another soul are breaking a chain. And those who look at themselves with compassion, even for a few seconds, are just beginning to be born. She didn't need altars or credentials or speeches. It was enough to know that every time she chose not to harden, she was healing something that came from far behind, something that wasn't hers alone, something that spoke for all the men who never cried, all the women who always carried the weight, all the children who had to be strong too soon. Because true love doesn't always make an announcement. Sometimes it's a gesture. Sometimes it's a shared silence. Sometimes it's a cracked flower pot in the middle of the table. Sometimes it's writing a letter to your 8-year-old self and finally saying, "You're not alone. I'm here, and this time, I'm not leaving." At a train station in Lisbon, just as the sunset began painting the buildings in golden melancholy, a man played the violin. He wasn't young. He wasn't a virtuoso. He wasn't seeking fame. He played like someone breathes, like someone who had made peace with the idea that not everything in life needs an explanation. Each note seemed to rise from a place beyond logic. Few watched him, and those who did didn't know why they stayed. It was as if the air changed when he played, as if suddenly rushing made no sense. Among those who stopped was Anna, 49, recently divorced, with a heart half-healed and a train ticket to a place she wasn't sure she wanted to go. She heard the melody and, without knowing why, felt that someone was finally saying what she hadn't been able to put into words. It was music, yes, but also permission, as if every note whispered to her. You can feel everything and still keep going. You can move forward without clarity. You cannot understand love and still be its home. She sat down on a rusted bench, closed her eyes, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't think about what came next. She allowed herself to just be, to breathe, without needing to fix anything, without having to justify herself. She felt that love wasn't something you find, nor something someone gives you. It was something that had always been inside. Hidden, yes. Silenced too. But waiting. Anna didn't need proof. She didn't need promises. She just needed to remember, to return to that place within her where love wasn't a transaction, where there were no merits, no conditions, no outcomes, where love meant seeing and staying. Love meant not running away. Love meant offering silence, not a solution. Love was what she felt in that music, a vibration that can't be explained, only recognized. That was the day she chose to return to herself, to the part of her that didn't want to be perfect, just real, to the part that didn't ask for answers, just warmth, to the part of her that was tired of instructions on how to love well. She wanted to love with what she had, with who she was, with what was still under construction. She let her train go, bought another one for later, wandered the streets without direction, knowing the map was no longer necessary, because something in her had become home. She understood that love is not linear, that it isn't always reciprocal or clear or fair, but that doesn't make it any less real, because there are loves that come just to wake you, others just to teach you how to let go, some to show you what you didn't know about yourself, and a few to stay. And sometimes, the one who stays is you. In a notebook she hadn't used in years, Anna wrote a phrase that didn't sound wise but felt true. I'm ready to not be ready, and to love from there. She read it aloud and cried, but this time without guilt, like someone watering a plant they still believe in. Years later, with silver hair and a quieter heart, Anna returned to that station. The violin was gone, so was the man, but the music was still inside. She bought a coffee, sat on the same bench and wrote a letter, not for anyone, for love. Dear love, I'm sorry I looked for you in the wrong hands. for demanding certainty when you could only offer presence. Thank you for not giving up, even when I did. Thank you for slipping into the notes of that violin when I needed you most. I recognize you now, not by what you give, but by how you bring me back to myself. I don't look for you anymore. I carry you. She tucked that letter into the pocket of a book and left it at the station, just in case someone else might need to read it one day. And as she walked away, she didn't feel alone. She felt like part of something greater, a hidden dance, a language that needs no words. Capítulo 4. Freedom is not conquered, it is remembered. In a corner of the world where people wake up each day without really knowing why, where alarms go off before the heart does, and daily tasks become excuses to avoid looking within, someone named Julian decided on a Monday that he would no longer pretend nothing was happening. It wasn't a crisis. It wasn't an epiphany. It was just a different kind of yawn, a subtle feeling that he could no longer keep denying himself. He had spent his life trying to comply, to be a good son, a good partner, a good employee, a good citizen. He had said yes too many times when his soul was screaming no. He had hidden so many parts of himself that he no longer knew which one was real. That Monday, as he made his coffee, he looked at it as if for the first time. He thought of all the years he had drunk it in a rush, without tasting it. He remembered how, as a child, he used to imagine the steam as clouds carrying him far away, to places without time, without duties, where he could simply be, without explanation. The image came back with such strength that he nearly dropped the cup, and right then he knew. He had forgotten he was free, not the kind of freedom that means doing whatever you want, a deeper freedom, the freedom to be who you are, without having to justify it, without asking for permission, the freedom to say this yes without fear and this no without guilt, the freedom to walk through life without a costume, to look at others without judging them, and above all, to look at yourself without condemnation. Julian turned off his phone, not to disconnect from the world, but to reconnect with his own. He walked through his neighborhood like a tourist. He greeted a neighbor he'd never spoken to. He sat in a plaza without checking the time. He listened to strangers' conversations without needing to chime in. He laughed to himself. He stared at the sky for a long time, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel lost. He felt present. Freedom takes many forms. Sometimes it's a quiet decision. Sometimes it's a sigh after years of holding it all in. Sometimes it's writing to someone just to say, I remember you with tenderness. Sometimes it's not replying to a message that only pulls you back into a place you've already left. Sometimes it's choosing a smaller life, but one that's truly yours. Sometimes it's saying, I don't want to keep pretending I like this. Julian began to live that way, with more pauses, with more listening, with more questions, and less fear of not having answers. He let himself have a day without ambition. He let himself not want to stand out. He let himself change his mind. He let himself desire simple things, an honest conversation, a well-chosen song, a cup of coffee that wasn't just an excuse but a ritual. His friends began to notice the change. Some drifted away. Others came closer. He didn't judge. He understood that freedom also means letting go of forced attachments, that everything held by obligation becomes heavy, and everything that flows through resonance becomes support. He stopped seeking belonging. He started practicing presence. One night he wrote in his journal, "Freedom is not conquered. It is remembered." That phrase struck him as truth, and he began to wonder how many things he did out of habit, fear, routine, or insecurity. He began to distinguish between his own desire and a borrowed one, between what expanded him and what shrank him, and he began to choose. Sometimes he got it wrong, but he no longer betrayed himself. One day, he visited his mother. With a trembling voice, she asked, "Are you okay?" He didn't answer with, "Yeah, all good," like he always had. He said, "I'm learning to be okay without lying to myself." She looked at him for a long while, and without saying anything else served him soup, because some truths don't need a reply, only shared silence. That night, Julian dreamed he could fly, not with wings, with memory. He dreamed he was a bird who didn't know it could fly until it stopped trying to walk like everyone else. He woke up with his chest full of something new, something like calm, or maybe it was self-love, or maybe it was just the absence of fear, which, in the end, is the same. From then on, he started writing letters to strangers. He'd leave them in cafes, in books, in mailboxes. No signature, no explanation. Just notes that said things like, "You don't have to be everything for someone to see you." Or, "Freedom begins when you stop asking for approval." Or simply, "You're alive. That's already enough." He never knew how many people read those letters. But he didn't need to, because true freedom doesn't need an audience. It only needs the intimate decision to return home, to the body, to the voice, to the intuition, to that part of you that has always known what is a yes and what is a no. Julian didn't become a role model. He became real. And in this world, that's already a miracle. He became someone who walks lightly, not because he carries nothing, but because he no longer hides it from himself. Someone who says, "I don't know," with love. Someone who listens with the soul. Someone who, when looking in the mirror, doesn't demand, but simply says hello. On an old street in Valparaiso, Chile, a single street lamp lit only part of the sidewalk. The rest remained in shadow, as if the light chose where to rest and whom to guide. A boy, walking with his mother, looked into the darkness with curiosity and softly asked, "Mom, why don't they turn on all the lamps?" She didn't reply right away. She looked at him, hugged him, and said, "Because if everything were lit, we'd stop appreciating the warmth of what does shine." That boy didn't fully understand, but years later, he would remember that sentence during his first great loneliness. He wrote it down on a piece of paper. If everything were always visible, we would lose the mystery that nourishes the soul. The adult mind, brother, works like that street lamp. It lights only a fragment and forgets there's an entire sky above, filled with stars it doesn't need to understand to be embraced by. The adult mind wants control, explanation, guarantees. But the soul doesn't. The soul doesn't want maps. It wants paths. It doesn't want happy endings. It wants real presence. And when that mature soul finally realizes it doesn't need to understand everything in order to live it, it begins to be born again. That's the secret no one tells us, that the joy of being alive often arises in that empty space that at first seems like loneliness, but is actually the sacred ground where intimacy with oneself begins. Not with the persona we created, but with that fragile, silent, imperfect part that trembles but does not run. The part that has no answers but keeps searching anyway. Adults often forget to celebrate mystery. They want everything clear, resolved, labeled. But the most precious things in life, deep love, true faith, authentic desire, meaning, are born in places the mind can't reach, where you have to close your eyes and trust. Like the moon, which is only visible in phases and yet is always there, orbiting steadily, stirring the tides of emotion without asking for recognition. Brothers of light, what a gift it is to remember that the invisible side of the moon is what makes us fall in love when it appears. What a gift to understand that something is always unfolding in the dark, in what we can't see, working in our favor. That there are absences that teach us how to value, silences that teach us how to listen, empty moments that teach us how to embrace the now. And in that interplay of shadow and light, life becomes a dance. Because the soul, when it stops demanding certainty, begins to recognize beauty. And when beauty is accepted without the need for explanation, something happens, something the mind cannot name but the body can feel. The soul settles into its home. You don't need to see everything to trust. You don't need to understand every emotion to feel valid. Sometimes the truest thing you can do is stay a little longer with what you don't know, with what you can't fix, with what hurts yet still connects you. Because you're not broken, you're alive. And living isn't about always shining. Living is about continuing to beat even when no lamps are lit. One night, a woman who had lost everything sat facing the sea. She wasn't looking for comfort, she was looking for forgetting. But in the ebb and flow of the waves, something stirred. It wasn't peace, nor relief. It was something older, something that said, without words, "I'm still here, even when you don't know what comes next." That night she didn't light up, but she didn't break either. And the next day she breathed differently. That is faith, brother. Not blind faith, but intimate faith. The kind that is born when you gaze at the dark side of the moon and whisper, "I know something is working even if I can't see it." So in this ending, I won't give you certainty. I'll remind you of this. Not knowing is also part of the journey. Your shadow is not against you. Your pause is also growth. What you can't explain might be what heals you the most. And if today you feel nostalgia, sadness, emptiness, or silence, maybe it's not because something is missing. Maybe it's because you're standing at the threshold of something being born that you cannot yet see. Today, brother, sister, wherever you are, just remember this. The invisible part of your story is holding you too. The part no one sees. The part you still don't understand. The part that can't be posted in photos. And if you ever feel far from the light, look at the moon. And remember, she doesn't always shine either, but she never stops orbiting. She never stops being. She never stops existing. The deepest freedom, the purest faith, the most sincere love. They don't need to be seen. They only need to be felt. Some days feel too much alike. They begin with the same light, the same breakfast, the same quiet question no one dares to ask aloud. Is this all there is? Clara, who had always dressed herself in enthusiasm even when feeling paused inside, woke up one Monday with a new kind of certainty. She could no longer keep postponing joy. Not because everything was fine, but because she could no longer keep living as if joy were a luxury reserved for when life finally made sense. That day brought no miracles. No background music played. No sign from the universe appeared. There was only a cup of hot coffee, a ray of sunlight sneaking in through the window, and a soft but firm decision. Today, I will seek joy, even if it hurts. Because that's what Clara understood. Joy doesn't always arrive when you're ready. Sometimes it shows up to shake you, to slap you sweetly, to remind you that your sadness does not define you, even if you have every right to feel it. That your silence is not a prison, even if you've learned to live inside it. That joy is not a goal. It is a way of resisting the inertia of fading away. Clara went for a walk with no route in mind. She left her phone at home. She breathed as if each lung were a poem. She sat in a park and allowed herself to laugh watching a dog run around with a bag in its mouth. It was a silly laugh, a real one, without analysis, a laugh that came from a forgotten corner of her childhood. And in that instant she knew she didn't need any more reasons to live than that second of truth. Joy, she thought, is not the younger sister of enlightenment. It's not a reward for having everything under control. It's a political, spiritual, and visceral act of saying to the world, despite everything, I'm still here, and I will not stop feeling. That day, Clara did something revolutionary. She didn't demand herself to be okay. She simply allowed herself to be. And in that pause, joy found its way in, not as euphoria, but as quiet gratitude. Julian, somewhere else in the world, read a letter he hadn't written. It was from his mother, who had passed away years ago, found by chance in an old notebook. It said, "If you ever forget how to laugh, look for my laughter in your own." He cried, not out of grief, out of recognition. Because in that line was everything he had been trying to find in retreats, in motivational quotes, in guided meditations: joy as inheritance, not as a promise, but as an act of memory. And then he understood something hard to accept, that it's okay to cry while you're smiling, that you don't have to choose, that the soul isn't binary, that it can hurt and shine at the same time. That joy doesn't erase pain, it illuminates it from another angle. Anna, who used to write letters to no one, wrote one that day to herself, not with advice, with simple truths. You will want to give up more than once, and you won't always be able to handle everything. But please, don't forget to dance when your favorite song plays, even if you're alone, even if you're afraid, even if you no longer remember the steps. She placed that letter under her pillow, not to reread it, but so it could hold her while she slept. Brother, we've mistaken joy for success, for happiness, for fulfillment. But true joy doesn't depend on outcomes. It doesn't come with applause. It doesn't need a plan. Joy is a fire that lights up in the middle of the cold, not when everything is fixed, but when you decide to live anyway, even if you don't understand how. It's not irresponsible to laugh amidst chaos. It's wise. It's brave. It's revolutionary. Because real joy doesn't deny the shadow. It embraces it, kisses it, and turns it into art. So if you're reading this with your soul clenched, your life on pause, your dreams cracked, breathe. And remember this: you're not required to have hope in order to dance. You don't need certainty to sing. Joy isn't a consequence. It's a rebellion, a whisper that says, I'm not giving up, and that is pure light. In a city where rooftop reflections show more screens than stars, Martina stopped at an ordinary street corner. She had crossed that same crosswalk hundreds of times, but that afternoon something made her pause, as if her shadow whispered, wait, just a second. The kind of seconds that don't change world history, but transform the whole history within. She looked up and saw the sky, not an epic sky, not a dramatic sunset, a regular, muted sky, the kind that seems to say nothing. But in that silence, Martina felt a voice inside, not from above or outside, but from deep within, from the place she hadn't dared to look in a long time. And that voice, without noise or order, simply said, I'm here, still waiting. Martina didn't know if it was her soul, her inner child, her body, or her intuition. She didn't know, and it didn't matter, because that phrase made her shoulders tremble, as if she'd been carrying a story that wasn't entirely hers, yet kept dragging along. She went home with a strange feeling. It wasn't sadness. It was something else, nostalgia for herself. She walked in, took off her shoes, and sat on the floor for no reason, like someone needing to touch the earth. She hugged her knees, closed her eyes, and heard it again. You didn't get lost. You just let go of me for a while. And then she broke, not into 1,000 pieces, but into one, the one that had grown the hardest. She cried, silently. The kind of tears that come when you reunite with your soul after years of evasion. Not dramatic tears, cleansing water. She remembered how many times she had tried to be better, stronger, smarter, more confident, more positive, more kind, more everything. But she had never asked herself whether that was what she needed or just what she thought others needed from her. She had never asked if her soul agreed with all those disguises. And now she knew. It didn't. It had been quiet, waiting, like people who love in silence until you return with clearer eyes. Martina breathed deeply, like someone finally stepping out of character. And in that sigh, she understood something. There was nothing broken in her. She had simply forgotten that she could sit beside her shadow without fear. From then on, she started doing something simple, yet revolutionary. She spoke to herself in a low voice. Upon waking, "Good morning, you're still here." Before leaving, "You don't have to prove anything." Before bed, You did your best today, even if it wasn't much. She started treating herself the way she'd treat someone she loves dearly, not because she had it all figured out, but because she realized you can't expect tenderness from life if you don't start by offering it to yourself. And that's when something began to change. Not outside, inside. The way she stayed with herself, the way she didn't flee from her cloudy days, the way she stopped demanding her soul to be clear skies all the time, the way she quit measuring herself against standards that distracted her from the only thing that truly matters, the peace of being in yourself without needing to be better or more or different. One night, while washing dishes, she remembered a line she once read in a forgotten book. "The soul doesn't break. It just hides." She said it out loud and smiled because she knew her soul had stopped hiding the moment she stopped running. She didn't need to do anything to make it come back. She didn't need to heal it. She didn't need to understand it. She just had to sit with it. Listen. Stop yelling from the place of demand. Stop asking, "Why aren't you okay?" And start asking, "What do you need today?" And from that sacred dialogue, her life became more inhabitable. Not more perfect, more intimate, more gentle, more free. Brother, sometimes we think we're far from ourselves because we feel empty, tired, disconnected. But often, it's not distance. It's silence. The silence of a soul that doesn't want fixing anymore, that only wants to be held, without goals, without therapy, without missions. Just a quiet, "I see you, and I don't need you to be any different." Maybe the hardest thing to accept isn't that we're lost, but that we never were, that the only thing lost was the practice of speaking to ourselves with love, of staying a little longer in our own company, of not fleeing from the body when it trembles, of not running from emotion like it's a mistake, of not covering pain with tasks, of not masking doubt with forced certainties. The soul doesn't get lost. The soul doesn't break. The soul doesn't leave. It just dims a little when we scream at ourselves from the inside. But the moment we lower the volume of that demand, it's there, waiting, like an old lantern, like a song with no lyrics, like a house you can always come back to. So today, if you feel lost, don't force yourself to be found. Just be still, quiet, breathe, and listen, because your soul is right there. It doesn't ask for miracles, only for permission. The world has become addicted to answers, to explanations, to soothing phrases that say nothing but calm everything down. We cling to a thread of false certainties, waiting for someone to tell us everything will be okay, as if the soul needed guarantees in order to rest. And yet, the most liberating thing that can happen to an adult mind is to accept that you don't have to understand everything to take a deep breath and move forward anyway. Pedro understood this on a random afternoon while trying to rebuild a relationship that no longer existed. He had called, texted, apologized for things he wasn't even sure were his fault. All he wanted was peace. All he wanted was for things to go back to how they were. But they didn't, because the other person was no longer where he wanted them to be. They had left, respectfully, with sadness, but they had left. At first, Pedro drowned in questions. He became a detective of someone else's heart. What did I do wrong? When did they stop loving me? What detail did I miss? And the more questions he asked, the farther he drifted from himself, because each answer left him emptier than the one before. There were no villains, no explanation that could make it right, just a closed door and an echo that whispered, "This too is life." That night, staring at the dining room lamp, Pedro said something to himself, not with drama, but with a depth only honest surrender can bring. "I don't understand, and I don't need to understand to keep going." It wasn't resignation, it was rest. And in that rest, something shifted. Not outside, inside. Because when you stop demanding answers from the universe, you begin to hear what silence has to offer. And silence, though it doesn't explain, consoles. Not because it tells you what to do, but because it whispers something no word can. You're alive, and that's enough. From that day on, Pedro became simpler, not in thought, but in presence. He started saying, "I don't know," with a peace that disarmed those expecting grand declarations. He began to listen without needing to fix. He began to love without needing to control. He began to understand that not knowing everything isn't a flaw. It's a mature way to exist in the world. Marina, in her own story, stopped asking questions the day her son asked her, "Do you ever feel sad and not know why?" Her voice cracked, because she had never thought that sadness could be part of a legacy too. She smiled, trembling. "Yes, my love. Sometimes I do, and it's okay not to know why." And in that moment, something ancestral healed, because she was teaching her son something no one had taught her, that discomfort is part of life, and you don't have to explain it in order to walk with it. From then on, whenever her soul felt heavy, she didn't rush to find answers. She lit a candle, made tea, walked in silence, sat still without needing to produce anything. She learned that a pause isn't failure. It's space, it's permission, it's self-love. In this human journey, there are things you won't understand. There are people who will leave without giving you closure. There are emotions that won't obey your plans. There will be days when everything seems meaningless, and yet your body will keep breathing, like it knows something your mind has forgotten. And maybe that's the lesson. Your body and your soul aren't waiting for you to figure it all out. They're waiting for you to stop fighting what cannot be known. You don't need to understand why they left, why it didn't work out, why it never arrived, why it all fell through. You don't need to understand it all in order to love again. You don't need to understand it all to trust again. You don't need to understand it all to look at the moon and feel that something sacred is still orbiting your life, even when everything seems to be on hold. The adult mind, when it finally becomes wise, stops seeking control. It seeks connection, and connection doesn't need certainty. It only needs truth, a humble truth, one that can say, "I don't know where this is going, but I'm still here." And that, brother, that is enough. So today, if you're tired of asking questions that lead nowhere, if you're exhausted from trying to make sense of everything before moving forward, I offer something kinder. Go on without understanding, but go on with your heart in your hands, with your eyes wide open, with your soul ready. Because clarity comes when you're no longer forcing it, and life, even when you don't understand it, is always on your side, even when you don't know how. In a world where everyone's rushing to be someone, where titles are collected like medals and smiles are stretched to look complete, tenderness walks barefoot, quietly, without prizes. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand. It doesn't need admiration. It only asks one thing: don't push it away when it shows up. Sophia had been many things in her life: a good daughter, the ideal partner, a tireless worker, a guide for others. She was one of those people who hold everything together, even when no one notices. Sometimes she cried silently in the office bathroom, washed her face, and came out with the usual phrase, "I'm fine." She had an almost magical ability not to break, but also not to fully feel. Until one day, at a family gathering, her 5-year-old nephew looked straight at her and asked, "Auntie, why are you sad if you're smiling?" No one else heard, but those words entered her body like an invisible key. Because the child wasn't judging her. He was seeing her. And in that unfiltered gaze, Sophia met herself for the first time in years. That night, she didn't cry. She just sat in silence for a long time, watching her reflection in the window. She wasn't looking for answers. She just wanted to stop lying with her face. She whispered to herself, "I don't have to hold it all together to be loved." And in saying those words, she felt something new, or maybe something ancient, as if the little girl she once was said from deep within, "Thank you for letting go." From that moment, Sophia began doing small things she used to consider unnecessary. She let herself be helped. She didn't correct the person trying to comfort her. She accepted hugs without explaining them away. She didn't smile out of duty. She answered honestly when someone asked, "How are you?" It wasn't about becoming more vulnerable. It was about no longer pretending to be strong when her body was asking for rest. She discovered that tenderness carries a wisdom deeper than any self-help book. A tenderness that isn't about softening everything but about staying close without pushing. A tenderness that can sit beside pain without rushing it, that doesn't seek solutions or demand explanations, just sits next to you and breathes with you. In an ordinary cafe, an older woman spilled her tea. Sophia walked over, handed her a napkin, and said with a gentle smile, "That happens to me all the time." The woman touched her hand and replied, "Thank you for not making me feel clumsy." No one else noticed, but Sophia did, because tenderness doesn't need witnesses, only truth. Martin, on his own path, had spent his life avoiding any appearance of weakness. Since he was a boy, he had been taught that men don't cry, that you have to be strong, that emotion causes disorder. He grew up wearing that invisible armor until one day, in front of a friend, he broke, not because of something dramatic, just from being tired, from feeling lonely without knowing why, from carrying too much inside with no words to release it. His friend didn't offer any deep insight. He simply placed a hand on Martin's shoulder and said, "I'm here." And that was enough. He didn't need more. After that day, Martin began to understand that tenderness is what's left when there's nothing left to prove, when you don't need to shine or be right, when you only need to be and be received, without correction, without polish, without competition. He started to notice that tenderness is everywhere, but often disguised to avoid discomfort. It's in the gesture of someone waiting without checking the time, in the message that says, "You don't have to reply right away," in the honest question that doesn't seek to manipulate, only to listen. On this journey towards soul freedom, the most radical thing we can do is not to shine, but to soften, to stay without demand, to look at someone without trying to fix them, to look at ourselves without trying to repair every flaw. Because tenderness, when it's real, doesn't ask permission. It just enters and finds you and stays a while and doesn't change you, but it reminds you. It brings you back to the place where you were simply you, unguarded. So today, if you're tired of proving yourself, if you feel buried under too many layers, if you find it hard to let yourself be cared for, remember this. Tenderness is not weakness. It's not fragility. It's not lesser. It's the bravest way to love in a world that teaches us to harden. It's the kind of embrace that asks for nothing in return. It's the whisper that says, "You're safe, even if you don't know what to do with what you're feeling." It's the art of staying without rushing. It's the energy that remains when there's nothing left to perform. And so, brother, sister of light, tenderness is the last torch still burning when all the lights go out. And sometimes, it's the only one you need. And if one day you ask why the moon doesn't show everything, this time don't search for the answer in her. Search for it in yourself. There are parts of the soul that don't need exposure, only maturing in the dark. Inner places where light would be too much, where time breathes differently. Some call it shadow, others fear, others simply truth without disguise. But whatever its name, that's where what's truly worth sharing is cooked. Because not everything that's shown is real, and not everything that's hidden is broken. There's beauty in what remains unseen. There's greatness in what goes unsaid. And now you know this. You made it here because some part of you always knew there was another way to be alive. Not more perfect, simply more your own. Within you, too, lives that nameless threshold where true transformation begins. Not the kind that arrives with fireworks, but with that quiet feeling of having come home without ever moving. Because in that return without steps, something awakens, as if your heart remembered what your mind had misplaced. That living is not about chasing meaning, but about embracing what already pulses. Maybe you had forgotten, overwhelmed by the noise of the world. But now you remember that you are made of the same questions that drove Edgar Allan Poe to write music disguised as stories, born from both fire and snow. The same doubts that accompanied Camille Claudel as she carved solitude into marble. The same trembling Rumi must have felt before writing Barefoot with his soul. You too are a fragment of Alfred Hitchcock's mystery, an echo of something unnamed that burns, that stirs, that moves. And that's why it matters how you end your day, not for morality, but for art. Because whoever ends their day with gratitude gives the universe permission to be reborn within them. It's not about affirmations. It's about inner rhythm. The kind Kazuo Ono had when he danced at 94, as if his skin still didn't know the weight of time. The kind found in a poem by Nizar Kabani, where love is a language with no translation, but always an accent in the soul. The kind in Marina Tsivetaeva's letters, written from darkness yet shining brighter than an entire city lit up. You can do it too. You can live as if every gesture were the final brushstroke, as if every word wove part of your invisible temple, as if every decision, even the smallest one, spoke on your behalf when you're no longer here to explain yourself. Because that is true freedom, not doing whatever you want, but doing what still represents you in your absence. Sometimes we think awakening means changing, but not always. Sometimes awakening is simply stopping the resistance to who we already are, letting the trembling show, letting laughter erupt without needing a reason, giving sadness a seat without asking it to apologize, letting desire stop asking for permission, letting the body speak, letting the soul say what it never dared to name because it thought it was too much to be accepted. And yet, that is what the world needs. Not your masks, not your control, but your presence, your real fire, your unscripted vulnerability, your silence filled with meaning. Because many teach, but few embody. And you came here to embody. You don't need to fully understand what you feel, but you must not abandon yourself. Don't shed your skin for approval. Don't force your soul to behave like a business plan. You can inhabit your strangeness. You can embrace your poetic contradictions. You can walk in zigzags and still move forward. Because that's how those who are truly alive walk, sometimes steady, sometimes drunk with wonder, sometimes broken and still standing. Look around. Life does not demand perfection. The flower Diffilea grayi becomes transparent when it rains, yet never loses its dignity. Architect Carlos Scarpa designed staircases that led nowhere, simply to honor the act of walking. Painter Zdzisław Beksiński created entire worlds where pain and beauty were the same thing, and he never explained them, because some experiences only make sense when you live them, not when you justify them. You can be that too, a space where the inexplicable has a home, where people can cry without needing to explain why, where love is not a strategy, where mystery is not unwelcome, where wisdom doesn't sound like superiority but like lucid tenderness. You don't need everything resolved. You need everything present, because if you are fully inside what you do, you are already alive. And life, when it's real, doesn't ask for outcomes, only presence. The kind Glenn Gould had as he played Bach like every key was a prayer, the kind a Zen monk has while pouring tea, the kind a child has when they don't know they're being watched. Make your life that kind of art. Not the kind meant to be displayed, but the kind meant to be lived. The kind that doesn't boast its beauty but leaves it floating in the air like someone leaving a scent without perfume. And if you fall, don't make it a tragedy. Make it a pause. Breathe. Remember Václav Nijinsky, who danced until his body dissolved into motion and still said that his true dance began when he could no longer control it. Sometimes losing control is finding the music that truly lives inside you. I'm not asking you to change the world, just don't betray yourself. And if you're going to change something, let it be your way of being with yourself. Because everything else, believe me, follows. And when you reach that place in you where nothing is argued, shouted, or sold, you'll know you've come home. That's where the noise ends and the music begins. Because now you know, it's not about going farther, it's about seeing differently. You no longer walk the same. You no longer feel the same. You no longer think the same. Something has been lit. Something has awakened. And even if you can't explain it, you can live it. From here, many flights await you. Flights without maps, but with direction. Flights where the soul needs no permission, only presence. Flights where your good vibe, your authentic fire, and your honored shadow will be wings enough to keep discovering what you've always been, life. And now you know that here at Let There Be Light, there will always be an open door for you, a word to help you breathe, to bring you back to yourself. And until then, live as if life were still writing you. Because it is, and you are part of its finest line.